have with us Professor Himanshu Rai, who is Director of IIM Indore. Sir, welcome to this session. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kumar. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, there is obviously a huge amount of change that organizations, academic institutions are going through, and several questions which are up in the air about the future of both higher education as well as the future of, if I can say, management practice within organizations. What are your views on that?
So some of the things are pretty obvious. And Kumar, one thing that I would want to say at the outset itself, that the world was changing.
True.
Whether it was for this pandemic or not, we were inexorably moving towards the post-fourth industrial revolution world.
True.
So there were a few things which were changing across the world. A couple of those things were, especially in particular, if I look at both management education and practice, so I'm talking about both scholarship and practice, that the kind of skill sets which would be required in the post-fourth industrial revolution world were going to be very, very different from the kind of skill sets which were required today. And therefore, a lot of these skill sets will either become obsolete or would be taken over either by robotics or artificial intelligence, or would be addressed through the machine learning processes.
True.
And therefore, we were looking at a very different world. We were going to look at a digitized world, both in management education as well as in the organizations. What this pandemic has done is two things. One, it has accelerated that process, which means that the digitization process, which was on the way in any ways, has now been accelerated, and increasingly organizations are looking to have now a coherent digital strategy. Likewise, institutions such as ours. So we already had online education. IIM Indore has been doing online education for a very, very long time in the domain of executive education. But what it has done is that instead of using some kind of a stackable method, so we were stacking resources, we were stacking equipment, we were stacking bandwidth. Now what this pandemic has forced us to do is, because the requirement of the bandwidth and the equipment is suddenly very high, it has forced us to look at a very coherent digital strategy. And therefore, what I think is that both the scholarship and the practice are increasingly going to look at the world which we are going to step into, see what are the kind of skill sets which are required to be able to navigate through that world, and in certain cases to even create that world, because we are going to be the creators of that world itself as well. And thereafter, see as to what kind of education in terms of content, and later what kind of pedagogical tools in terms of delivery would be required to best disseminate that particular education. So that, according to me, is something that we will see happening.
Sure. How is in your experience, the response been from institutions such as yours, as well as leading organizations, to the last 8-10 months, whatever has been happening in India? I think India has been a little bit of a unique situation. We weren't in a great economic environment going into the pandemic. As you rightly said, we were lagging behind in digitalization to a very large extent. And even now, it's not going to be a complete work from home, a complete digital story for most organizations, because we still have a very large unorganized sector, a very large number of SMEs, a very large rural play. So given all of this, what do you see has been some of the key trends in terms of the responses that have come across?
So, Kumar, it's a mixed bag, actually. And I'll tell you as to why is it a mixed bag. And it's a mixed bag for both institutions as well as business organizations, and for both kinds of business organizations and institutions which have been considerate, which have been forward-looking, and those which have possibly lagged behind. And I'll explain to very quickly as to how and why. You see, our initial response, for example, if I take IIM Indore, we very quickly moved online. Within a week, we were the first ones to actually ask our students to go back home in view of the pandemic and view of the concerns that particularly the parents and the families had so far as the students are concerned. And within a week, we managed to get our entire education system online. Now, this is the good part of it, because we had the resources. The not so good part of it, or rather the realization that came to us much later, was that we were focusing on our resources, and while we had the resources, we did not fathom, we could not anticipate that our participants did not have those kind of resources. Sure. So we may have the best of the equipment, we may have the best bandwidth so far as the institute is concerned, but there were participants who were living in far-flung areas. There were participants who live in areas where you just have 2G. There are participants who do not have those many equipment so far as their houses are concerned. Possibly the family shares equipment, possibly the family shares laptop, phone, etc. And therefore, I think one of the places where we erred or where we could have done better was to anticipate this. However, institutions such as ours, likewise business organizations who were forward thinking and who were compassionate, very quickly realized that we need to look at the participants and thereafter try to do something to mitigate it. So for example, at IIM Indore, we started looking at other ways in which we can actually disseminate the content, etc. So we made sure that everything was videoed, all the videos were recorded, and those videos were available for our participants to actually downstream and to look at them whenever they got the bandwidth. Sure. We also made sure that for our differently able participants, we send them the material, the hard copy of the material subsequently. We also made sure that those participants who did not have books managed to get the ebooks. So we talked to the publishers, managed to get some of the books into the ebook format, and then made sure that it went to them. Likewise, if you look at the organizations, the great organizations, when the migrant crisis happened, when the labor started moving from one place to the other, happened simply because most of the organizations did not anticipate. They did not see what was happening to their workforce. So, enabling conditions for that workforce to stay back and to take care of them. Now, this is not to point a finger. Maybe they did not have the resources to. So I think one of the lessons that one needs to draw from this is that organizations going ahead will need to allocate certain resources for contingencies such as this, which are not unforeseeable. There are some things which are foreseeable. There are some things which are unforeseen. And I think this pandemic has taught us, because this virus is unforeseeable. It's unknowable. We still don't know how this virus is mutating. We still don't know what this virus is doing, what is it not doing, how can it be really contained. There are multiple theories. None of the theories have fit into the way this virus has actually progressed. And therefore, I think organizations will need to keep a part of their resources for such events, which are absolutely unforeseeable. Likewise, educational institutions such as ours. But the biggest lesson that I think that we have learned is that in times of crises, one has to be compassionate. And compassion means not merely stopping at sympathizing. So not merely stopping at sympathizing with, say, the migrant workers, or sympathizing with the students, with the participants who do not have access to the kind of resources that are required for quality learning to be actually imparted, but do something beyond sympathy, do something to mitigate those conditions, do something to actually help those people. And I think this is one of the biggest lessons that we have learned. And there's a second part to your question as well, which I think is a very interesting one, that going forward, do we see this work from home becoming a normal? And do we see this as something which the companies are increasingly going to adopt? Now, Kumar, I want to raise a question over here. It's not merely a question of do we see it happening. For example, I think Microsoft, for at least certain job profiles, has already said that they are going to offer a work from home for life. True. My question is that as academics, as business leaders, as leaders of institutions such as ours, the scholarship and the practice have to come together and first answer the question, should we do it? Yeah. Forget the fact. Absolutely. Should we be doing it? Why? Because it might sound very hunky-dory saying that work from home for life is actually going to be beneficial for the people. I don't think so. I don't think so. For example, what we have also realized, at least so far as our students are concerned and our participants are concerned, that because of this increased screen time, there are health-related issues, there are sleep-related issues, there are dietary issues, there are mental health problems. Now, when you talk about work from home for life, you are actually eliminating that separating line between a home and a workplace. Please remember, home is my sanctuary. Home is what I come back to. Home is what gives me. Home is what, in some sense detoxifies me. I come back to a family. Now, if I'm bringing my work to my home, I'm actually in some ways violating the sanctity of my home. And this is purely from a philosophical perspective.
Sure.
Now, let's even talk about pragmatic perspective. Imagine an entire family. Now, you and I may have this privilege of living in houses which are reasonably big. Imagine a family living in a 2-bedroom house with both husband and wife working with a couple of kids who are in school, and imagine everyone at home. Do you really think that's possible? It's not. It's going to impact their work because obviously they have to speak. There will be other works, other chores to be done. Who's going to do what? How are you actually going to share the equipment? How are you actually going to share the bandwidth? So both emotional, physical, and economic pressure of the work from home are going to be far more on people who are being forced to, or even who choose to thinking that it's going to be okay. But it is going to have a social cost. It's going to have an economic cost. And unfortunately, it may also have a domestic cost in terms of relationships. And I don't think, therefore, we must start either applauding it. We must think through this very, very carefully and first answer, do we really want it, before even trying to think about how are we going to facilitate it.
Oh, that's very right. Since you mentioned about domestic costs, this obviously has taken a toll on everyone in some way or the other, right? Like you said, the blurring of work life. Personally, and as a leader, how has the last 8-10 months been for you, and what are some of the learnings that you can share for other leaders who are going to see this?
So for me, one of the biggest learnings, Kumar, has been the thing about compassion. And I think this is one of the critical elements of crisis leadership, according to me. In fact, I am in the process of writing a book on crisis leadership. And the encouragement and the motivation comes from the kind of lessons that I learned over here in the last 8 months. I'll give you a couple of examples as well about what do I really mean. When we went for the lockdown, and we had only 10% of the support staff inside IIM Indore. And though the students were back, there were some students which were still here. For example, the doctoral students for whom this happens to be home. There were 150 families who were living here. And therefore, we needed to take care of them. We needed to also take care of the academic block, even though it was not being used. We needed to make sure that the hostels were sanitized, even if they were empty. We needed to make sure that this entire 193-acre of campus is well maintained, no matter whether you have the students or not. And therefore, we required personnel. And therefore, what did we do? I called upon the IIM Indore community. And much to my delight, the entire community came together, which means the families of my faculty members, the families of my staff, the families of my officers. They came and they devoted their time. They devoted their time to look after security, gardening, looking after the dog shelter, looking at the mess, including cleaning the tables and cleaning and mopping the academic block and the hostels, etc. So we came together as a community. And therefore, to me, one of the biggest lessons was that if you are compassionate and if you have the right intent, people will always come together to collaborate. So that was one of the lessons that I learned. The second lesson that I learned, that as we went through this entire process of lockdown and then subsequently unlockdown, many a times as a leader, you have to make decisions which may not be the popular decisions. And you have to understand, you have to be far more understanding. You have to be completely devoid of ego to be able to understand as to why people do things the way they do, why people think things the way they do, because everyone is at the edge. We are fortunate that we have this 193-acre campus, but I can imagine the life of those who were stuck in their houses and couldn't even step out of their house, even to take a walk or some such thing. So that way we were blessed. But because we have been used to this kind of a life, even this looked like a restriction to a lot of my colleagues, to a lot of the IIM Indore community, etc. And therefore, at times you have to take a decision which may not be the popular, which means extending the lockdown on certain things, extending the ban on certain activities, making sure that what is in your hands, which means physical distancing, wearing of the masks, etc., you implement it very, very rigorously. And therefore, you have this antardvandva, you have this conflict in your mind that should you do things which would make you more popular, or should you do things that you deem to be right? Should you do things that a majority of the people seem to be saying is the right thing to do, or should you use your own discretion and judgment while listening to them, but at the end of the day making your own decisions? And therefore, to me, it was a brilliant lesson in leadership during crisis that I actually faced and through my experiences learned over here. And thankfully, I'm glad to share, Kumar, that I think it has made all of us more compassionate. It has made all of us more tolerant to listening to the voices of dissent, and it has made most of us more courageous to take decisions in the times of adversity, which subsequently people come and say, hey, you did the right thing.
No, clearly. And, when you're hit with that crisis, obviously, we don't have the foresight to be able to exactly know that what I'm doing is 100% correct, right? There's always, like you said, an element of self-doubt on your own decision making. No, thank you so much, Himanshu. You shared some really good insights, and I'm sure everyone watching is really sort of making notes and trying to see what lessons they can draw from your experience. Thank you so much.
My pleasure entirely, Kumar. Thank you so much.